8 children died in this case. This did not happen during a war or in a conflict zone, but inside an ordinary elementary school in Japan, a country that for many years had been considered one of the safest in the world. On June 8, 2001, at around 10 in the morning, a normal school day was beginning at an elementary school in the city of Ikeda, Osaka Prefecture. At that moment, 37-year-old Mamoru Takuma entered the school grounds. He was a man with an officially diagnosed mental disorder. The investigation would later establish that, long before that day, he had repeatedly undergone forced psychiatric treatment, including multiple hospitalizations ordered by doctors. Each time, he was discharged after his condition stabilized, because at the moment of discharge, he was assessed as not posing an immediate threat to others. It is this decision, the decision to classify him as temporarily safe, that would become the central issue of this case. 8 children died in this case. This is a fact that cannot be ignored. But if we stop there, the story of Mamoru Takuma turns into just another case of a criminal lunatic. That is how it is often presented. The problem is that such a presentation explains nothing. On June 8, 2001, at around 10 in the morning, in the city of Ikeda, Osaka Prefecture, an elementary school was attacked by 37-year-old Mamoru Takuma. Japan was shocked. But for the doctors who had worked with him before, and for the institutions that already had his file, this man was not unknown. Takuma had been on the radar of the medical system for many years. His mental problems were officially documented. These were not rumors or assumptions made by neighbors. They were medical records, diagnoses, hospitalizations, and formal treatment decisions. According to the investigation, long before 2001, he had repeatedly undergone psychiatric treatment. At different times, he was hospitalized due to aggressive behavior, an unstable mental state, and being a threat to himself and others. This was not a case of short-term stress or mild depression, but serious disorders that required medical intervention. Here, one point is crucial. Japan does have a system of forced hospitalization, but it is strictly limited by law. A person can be kept in a hospital only if doctors believe that he poses an immediate threat. If the condition stabilizes, even temporarily, the patient must be discharged. This is exactly what happened to Takuma, again and again. His medical records showed that after treatment his condition improved. He became calmer, showed no open aggression, and agreed to take medication. Formally, the doctors had every reason to conclude that, at the moment of discharge, he was not dangerous. But this raises the first serious question. If a person is hospitalized multiple times for dangerous behavior and then discharged each time because the condition has stabilized, does that mean the problem has disappeared? Or does it simply mean it has been postponed? Case files show that after each discharge, Takuma returned to ordinary life without constant supervision. There was no mechanism for long-term monitoring. There was no system that connected medical data with information from the police or social services. Each institution saw only its own fragment of the story. The police recorded isolated incidents, but had no full access to medical reports. Doctors treated the patient in the hospital, but did not monitor his behavior after discharge. Social services worked with paperwork, but lacked the authority to intervene more deeply. As a result, a person with serious mental disorders was never formally considered dangerous enough by any single system to justify detention or strict control. There is another important detail. According to the investigation, Takuma himself understood that something was wrong with him. He did not completely deny his condition. He sought help. He underwent treatment. And yet, alongside this, there were episodes of aggression, impulsivity, and loss of control. This creates an uncomfortable but critical situation. On one side, a patient who formally follows medical instructions and temporarily stabilizes. On the other, a pattern showing that the problem does not disappear, it only quiets down. After the tragedy, the police reconstructed the full chronology of his contacts with medical institutions. The picture that emerged was far more alarming than it had appeared before. There were warning signs. Not one or two, but none of them became decisive. And here we reach the key point of this case. The attack on the school was not the beginning. It was the end point of a long chain of decisions that, taken individually, seemed reasonable, but together led to catastrophe. In next part, we will analyze in detail what signals the doctors recorded in their reports and why those records never triggered stricter action. This is where we see how the system gradually lost control. After the tragedy, the police began doing what they often do too late, reviewing Mamoru Takuma's entire medical history over the years. Not in fragments, not in isolated certificates, but as a whole. And it was at this moment that the case began to look completely different. According to official records, Takuma had repeatedly sought psychiatric help as early as the mid-1990s. He was hospitalized not for fatigue or depression, but for serious behavioral disorders. Medical reports contain phrases such as aggressive impulses, loss of control, and risk of dangerous actions. This matters. These were not vague notes about a bad mood. These were explicit warnings. One medical report, later cited in court, directly stated that the patient could pose a threat if he discontinued treatment or found himself in a stressful situation. At the same time, it noted that during the examination he behaved calmly, answered questions logically, and showed no immediate aggression. Those words, no immediate threat, became decisive. Within the Japanese psychiatric care system, this wording means only one thing. There is no legal basis to keep the person hospitalized. A doctor may recommend treatment, may prescribe medication, but if the patient appears stable, discharge is mandatory. Takuma was discharged. More than once. And each time, for the same reason. After each discharge, he returned to normal life. Without constant supervision. Without mandatory follow-ups. Without any system to verify whether treatment actually continued. And here the second critical question arises. If a doctor writes that the risk increases if treatment is discontinued, then who is responsible for monitoring whether that treatment continues? The answer turned out to be simple: no one. The police, meanwhile, had their own encounters with Takuma. Not related to the school, but connected to episodes of aggressive behavior. These incidents did not always reach court, but they were documented in police reports. The problem was that these reports existed separately from medical records. Doctors never saw the full police history. Police officers never had access to complete medical diagnoses. Each institution saw only a fragment. When investigators, after the tragedy, finally combined this information, a different picture emerged: a man who had been balancing on the edge for years, but had never formally crossed the threshold of being dangerous enough. At least on paper. There is another aspect that is rarely discussed. According to doctors, Takuma did not appear disconnected from reality. He understood where he was. He answered questions. He could explain his actions. This created an illusion of control. From a medical standpoint, he could be considered managed. In real life, the danger never disappeared. Later in court, a sentence was spoken that explains a great deal. One expert stated that the system was designed to react only when a threat became obvious. But in this case, the threat was cumulative. Like cracks in a wall. Individually, they don't seem dangerous. But when there are many of them, the structure can collapse without warning. That is exactly what happened here. The most disturbing part of this story is not the discharges themselves. Is the fact that each new discharge relied on the previous one. Once a person was labeled temporarily stable, it created a precedent. Every subsequent decision seemed logical because it was based on earlier conclusions. No one stepped back and said, "Stop. Let's look at the entire history." As a result, by 2001, Mamoru Takuma was a man with an extensive medical record, but with no real restrictions on his daily life. And one more thing matters. Before the attack itself, there was a moment that clearly showed the situation was slipping out of control. A signal that could no longer be dismissed as temporary instability. In next part, we will examine the final weeks before the tragedy, specific events and actions that, by any rational standard, should have become a stopping point. That is where it becomes clear that there was still a chance to prevent it. And that chance was very close. When looking at this case years later, it is easy to say it was inevitable. But if we return to the end of 2000 and the beginning of 2001, the picture looks different. There were several moments when the story could still have been stopped. And these moments were not abstract, they were very concrete. According to the investigation, in the month leading up to the attack, Mamoru Takuma's behavior began to deteriorate again. This did not happen overnight. It was a gradual return to a condition that doctors had already observed before. The difference was that this time, he was outside the hospital. Medical documents later presented in court noted problems with treatment compliance. In simple terms, he did not always take his prescribed medication as directed. To someone outside the medical field, this may sound minor. In psychiatry, however, irregular or discontinued medication often leads to a rapid decline in condition. This leads to an obvious question. If doctors had previously stated that the risk increased when treatment stopped, why was no one monitoring whether treatment continued? The answer is straightforward. No such mechanism existed. The police had their own warning signs. Several months before the attack, incidents involving aggressive behavior were recorded. They did not result in serious criminal cases, but given his medical background, they should have raised concern. Instead, these episodes were once again assessed in isolation, without reference to his psychiatric history. In practice, the system worked like this. If there was no direct crime, there was no basis for intervention. If there was no visible psychosis during examination, there was no basis for hospitalization. Everything that fell between those two thresholds simply disappeared from view. Another detail emerged after the tragedy. During this period, Takuma's general psychological state was deteriorating. Friends and relatives described him as increasingly isolated, irritable, and unstable. These were not sudden outbursts that would immediately attract police attention. It was a slow, steady decline. Here is an important point that is often overlooked. Many dangerous individuals do not appear dangerous all the time. They can seem calm for long periods. That is precisely what creates a false sense of safety. Case files also noted that during this period Takuma expressed thoughts that doctors found disturbing. But once again, they were not explicit enough to justify immediate isolation. Individually, each signal appeared insufficient. Taken together, they formed a highly dangerous pattern. This brings us to a moment that is especially important. A few weeks before the attack, Takuma had already reached a condition that had previously resulted in hospitalization. This time, however, hospitalization did not happen. Why? Because he was not technically breaking the law. He was not attacking anyone at that moment. He was not involved in an incident that forced immediate police action. He was simply a person who had gone bad. Now consider the system's perspective. A doctor sees a patient who appears unstable, but not openly aggressive. A police officer sees a minor incident with no serious outcome. Social services see documents with no legal basis for emergency action. Each has a reason to do nothing. Together, those reasonable decisions produced a situation in which no one acted. In the days that followed, Takuma began preparing for what would come. This was not a sudden breakdown in a single moment. It was a process. After his arrest, he spoke about it himself, and those statements later became part of the case file. At this point, the story enters a phase where chance no longer matters. When a person reaches this stage, the question is no longer whether a tragedy will occur, but where and when. In the next part, we will examine the day of the attack minute by minute, without unnecessary detail. We will look at how he reached the school, why no one stopped him at the entrance, and what happened in the first moments after it began. That is where it becomes clear that even on that day, there was still a chance to stop him. And that chance was lost. June 8, 2001 did not begin as anything unusual. For most people, it was a normal work morning. For the school in Ikeda, it was an ordinary school day. Nothing suggested that anything was about to happen. Mamoru Takuma woke up early. According to the investigation, he was not in a state of panic or confusion. On the contrary, his actions that morning appeared deliberate and controlled. This point is important because later many tried to describe what happened as an impulsive breakdown. The facts suggest otherwise. He left his home, boarded a train, and traveled to the city of Ikeda. It was a routine route, without anything suspicious. Station cameras recorded a man who behaved calmly, drew no attention to himself, and showed no outward signs of extreme intent. And once again, an important question arises. If a person has had a psychiatric record for years, yet can freely move through the city, use public transportation, and raise no suspicion, where exactly is the line between normal behavior and real danger? At around 10 o'clock in the morning, Takuma approached the grounds of an elementary school. At that time, Japanese schools did not have heightened security measures. There were no metal detectors, no constant checks at the entrance. A school was considered one of the safest places possible. He entered the school grounds without any resistance. According to the investigation, in the first minutes after his arrival, no one perceived him as a serious threat. Adults did not see immediate danger. And once again, the same logic applies. The threat did not appear obvious until it was too late. Once the attack began, the situation escalated rapidly. Police were alerted almost immediately, but in such cases, time works against everyone. Even a few minutes can determine the outcome. When the first police units arrived, the situation was already critical. Takuma was detained, but the tragedy had already occurred. What shocked even experienced officers was his behavior. He did not attempt to flee. He did not actively resist arrest. He remained calm. This detail later played an important role in the investigation. After his detention, Takuma was taken directly to a police station where initial interrogations began. According to investigators, he was fully oriented in time and place. He understood where he was and what had happened. This again shattered the simple image of a madman unaware of his actions. Early interrogation records showed that he was conscious of what he had done. He spoke about his actions without visible emotion, without panic, sometimes almost clinically. For investigators, this was a signal that the case would be far more complex than a straightforward claim of insanity. At this point, a new problem emerged. If a person has serious mental disorders but understands his actions, how should he be classified? Where does responsibility begin and end? From that moment on, the case stopped being purely criminal and became legal and medical at the same time. In the first hours after the attack, media coverage quickly simplified the narrative. A mentally ill man attacked a school. But investigators already understood that this explanation accounted for only part of what had happened. The case files contained medical histories, records of previous hospitalizations, police reports. Together, they showed that the attack was not sudden. One officer later summed it up with a sentence that captured the essence of the case. We stop him in minutes. But no one stopped the system that led him here for years. And that may be the most disturbing part of this story. In the next part, we will examine Takuma's first interrogations in detail, what he told investigators, how he explained his actions, and why his words raised more questions than answers. This is where the simple explanation of mentally ill, end of story, begins to collapse. The first interrogations of Mamoru Takuma began almost immediately after his arrest. Investigators acted quickly, fully aware that this would not be a simple case. Within the first hours, it became clear that the standard narrative, a mentally ill person unaware of his actions, did not fully apply. During questioning, Takuma remained calm. He did not confuse dates, understood where he was, and responded logically. Investigators noted that he did not appear disoriented or in state of acute psychosis at that moment. This assessment was formally recorded in the interrogation protocols. This is where the first serious conflict in the case emerged. If a person has severe mental disorders but is simultaneously aware of his actions, how should he be classified? This question immediately divided the experts. From the perspective of criminal law, the police saw a man who planned his actions, moved through the city independently, maintained contact with reality, and after arrest could clearly explain what had happened. To them, this indicated one thing: he understood what he was doing. Medical experts viewed the situation differently. They pointed to his long psychiatric history, illnesses, diagnoses, hospitalizations, and chronic instability. From their perspective, awareness alone did not automatically mean full mental responsibility. This gap between the two interpretations became central to the entire case. During interrogations, Takuma did not openly attempt to deny responsibility. He spoke about his actions directly and did not try to shift blame onto others. This, too, was documented in the case materials, and it further complicated the picture. At a certain point, investigators realized they were not dealing with a person who had lost contact with reality, but with someone who had lived with an internal conflict for years and had finally reached a breaking point. Another important detail surfaced during questioning. Takuma spoke about his life before the tragedy, about treatment, about discharges, about how, after each hospitalization, he was simply released back into ordinary life, without real support, without any long-term plan. For investigators, this became a warning signal, because what he described matched exactly what the documents already showed: a system operating in short cycles, incapable of seeing long-term consequences. Interrogation records also indicate that Takuma acknowledged that something was wrong with him. This was not a total rejection of reality. It was awareness of a problem without the ability to control it. And here, the boundary between mentally ill and legally responsible became especially fragile. Investigators began preparing for a trial that would be complex and prolonged. Psychiatric experts would have to be involved. Old medical records analyzed. Conflicting medical opinions compared. And it was at this stage that another troubling question emerged. If the system had known about this man for years, if there were medical warnings and police incidents, why was the issue of stricter measures never raised earlier? Why did the story effectively reset after each discharge as if nothing had happened? This question went beyond one individual. It touched on laws, regulations, and broader approaches to managing people with severe mental instability. At this point, the case stopped being purely criminal. It became a case about systemic responsibility, about where medicine ends and law begins, and who should make the final decision when a potential threat exists. But the most critical development was still ahead. During trial preparation, it became clear that there was no consensus among psychiatric experts regarding Takuma's condition. Some argued that he was not legally responsible. Others insisted that he fully understood his actions. This division proved decisive. In the next part, we will examine the forensic psychiatric evaluations in detail, what the doctors actually wrote, why their conclusions contradicted one another, and how these expert opinions shaped the outcome. It is there that it becomes clear the fate of this case was decided not only in the courtroom, but behind closed doors in expert offices. When the case reached the courtroom, it became clear that the central question would not be what happened, but in what state he was in when it happened. The facts of the attack were undeniable. They were not in dispute. But the question of responsibility depended entirely on medical conclusions. The court ordered a series of forensic psychiatric examinations. They were conducted by different specialists, independently of one another. And after the first reports, it became obvious there would be no unified opinion. One group of experts concluded that Mamoru Takuma suffered from a severe mental disorder that had influenced his behavior for many years. They referred to his medical history, repeated hospitalizations, documented aggressive impulses, and episodes of loss of control. According to their assessment, at the time of the attack, his ability to fully control his actions was significantly impaired. Another group of specialists reached a completely different conclusion. They focused on Takuma's behavior on the day of the attack and immediately afterward. He planned his route. He chose the timing. He was aware of his surroundings. During interrogations, he clearly explained his actions and showed no signs of a complete break from reality. For these experts, this meant one thing. Despite his mental illness, he understood what he was doing and understood the consequences. At this point, the case reached a deadlock. Both sides relied on documented facts. Both presented coherent arguments. Neither position could simply be dismissed. The court found itself caught between two logics that directly contradicted each other. On one side stood medicine, viewing mental illness as a long-term process. On the other stood the law, which evaluates responsibility at the precise moment of action. This was not an abstract debate. The verdict depended on it. If Takuma were declared insane, it would mean that the system that had repeatedly discharged him over the years had fundamentally failed. If he were declared sane, responsibility would rest solely on him, not on the rules that allowed him to remain free. There is a moment in the court records that many consider decisive. During one examination, Takuma stated that he understood his actions were wrong, but that he saw no other way out. This sentence echoed through the courtroom and provoked a strong reaction. For some, it was proof of awareness. For others, it was evidence of a deep internal conflict beyond his control. One thing must be emphasized. The court was not searching for a morally satisfying answer. It was searching for a legally valid one. And in cases like this, the law leaves very little room for nuance. As the examinations continued, previously undisclosed details began to surface. Some doctors who had treated Takuma in the past admitted after the tragedy that they had recognized the risk, but lacked the legal authority to act differently. This was an uncomfortable revelation, because it meant that even when danger was identified, the system itself prevented intervention. The court proceedings were long and complex. Each side defended its position, but with every session it became clearer, the verdict would be severe. Not only for Takuma, but for how similar cases would be approached in the future. There is another point that is rarely stated openly. Regardless of the verdict, it could not bring the murdered children back. But it could establish a precedent. And everyone in that courtroom understood this. In the end, the court reached a conclusion that shocked part of the medical community, but followed strict legal logic. Mamoru Takuma was found sane and fully responsible for his actions. This ruling marked a turning point. The case entered its final phase, sentencing. And it is here that another detail emerges, one that complicates this story even further. After being declared sane, Takuma made a statement that forced many to reconsider the entire case. He did not ask for leniency. He did not attempt to evade punishment. In the next part, we will examine the sentence itself, the public reaction, and what followed after the trial. We will also discuss one change Japan made after this case, and one safeguard that might have prevented the tragedy if it had existed earlier. After the court found Mamoru Takuma sane, the subsequent course of events was, on the one hand, predictable, and on the other, still shocking. In cases like this, the Japanese system does not favor half measures. If a person is deemed fully responsible for their actions, the law provides for the most severe punishment. The trial lasted several years. The defense repeatedly returned to the issue of Takuma's mental state, but the court's position remained unchanged. He understood what he was doing. He planned his actions. He was aware of the consequences. And therefore, he bore full responsibility. In 2004, the court delivered its sentence, the death penalty. Public reaction varied, but the overall mood was clear. After a tragedy in which 8 children were killed, the majority of Japanese society supported the harsh verdict. Media discussions often included phrases such as restoring justice and the absence of any alternative punishment. At the same time, a quieter discussion began to emerge. Doctors, psychiatrists, and human rights advocates started asking questions that had no simple answers. If a person had been treated for years, identified as dangerous, and yet released repeatedly, could all responsibility be placed solely on that individual? And if so, what did that imply for similar cases? These questions did not dominate headlines. They were rarely discussed publicly. But over time, they began to shift the tone of how the case was viewed. Takuma himself remained as calm after the verdict as he had been during interrogations. He did not file appeals seeking a reduced sentence. According to his lawyers, he accepted the court's decision as inevitable. For some, this seemed strange. For others, it appeared consistent with his behavior throughout the entire case. At this stage, attention began to shift. Analysis no longer focused solely on Takuma's actions but also on the tragedy itself, particularly from a security standpoint. Schools became a central point of concern. Before 2001, Japanese schools were largely open environments. The idea that someone could simply walk in from the street and pose a lethal threat seemed almost unthinkable. The events in Ikeda destroyed that assumption. In the aftermath, new security measures were introduced across many regions. Surveillance cameras, access controls, and security personnel became more common. Measures once considered unnecessary were now viewed as essential. Yet the most intense debate did not center on school security, but on the psychiatric system. Within professional circles, Takuma's case became a reference point, an example of a system that reacted only when it was already too late. Many doctors acknowledged that their actions had been formally correct. But formal correctness, as the case showed, does not always equal real effectiveness. In Parliament and specialized commissions, discussions began about possible legislative changes. These included long-term monitoring of patients with severe disorders, improved cooperation between medical institutions and police, and the creation of unified databases, mechanisms that had not existed before 2001. It is important to note that these changes did not happen overnight. The debates continued for years. But Takuma's case was repeatedly cited as the reason they had become unavoidable. And yet, even here, the story does not end. A verdict is not the final chapter. In Japan, years can pass between a death sentence and its execution. During that time, a person can change. They can rethink their words. They can make statements that once again raise difficult questions. That is exactly what happened later. In the next part, we will examine the final years of Mamoru Takuma's life, his behavior after sentencing, and one detail that caused many to reconsider the entire case, whether this story truly ended with the verdict, or whether it only then acquired its final meaning. After the verdict, Mamoru Takuma's case gradually disappeared from the news. For most people, the story seemed to end the moment the court announced the death sentence. In reality, however, it entered another phase, a much quieter one. A phase that is rarely discussed, even though it reveals a great deal about the system itself. In Japan, a death sentence does not mean immediate execution. Convicted prisoners can spend years on death row without knowing the exact date. Takuma was no exception. He remained in prison for years, completely isolated from the outside world, under a strict regime with minimal contact. According to official sources, during this period his mental state remained unstable, yet controlled. He was under constant medical supervision, took prescribed medication, and regularly communicated with doctors. And here a strange realization emerges. It was only in prison that he finally found himself inside a system that did not return him to normal life. For many, this feels like a bitter irony. What the civilian system of treatment and supervision failed to provide was achieved only after the tragedy had already occurred. During these years, Takuma made almost no public statements. He gave no high-profile interviews. He did not attempt to draw attention to himself. According to his lawyers, he understood that the case was closed for society and made no effort to reopen it. At the same time, he did not submit petitions for clemency. He did not seek to reduce his sentence. This, too, raised questions. People in similar situations usually cling to any remaining opportunity. That did not happen here. Some legal experts later noted that this behavior further reinforced the court's confidence in its decision. Takuma did not deny responsibility. He did not attempt to shift blame. Yet once again, this did not align with the simple image of a person who understands nothing. Meanwhile, the case continued to live on in professional circles. It was analyzed at conferences, discussed in medical journals, and examined in closed conversations between doctors and legal specialists. It became a textbook example of what happens when a system views a person only in fragments. One psychiatrist later summarized the case with a sentence that captured its essence: "We treated the symptoms, but we had no tools to control the consequences." This reflected a broader recognition. The system did not deny that it had followed the rules, but it slowly began to acknowledge that those rules were insufficient. During this period, the state gradually adjusted its approach to psychiatric supervision. Not suddenly, and not publicly, but step by step. Mechanisms for information sharing were strengthened. Discussions began about long-term monitoring and support for patients with severe disorders. And while these changes cannot be attributed to a single case alone, Takuma's case was repeatedly cited as an example of why such reforms were necessary. As for Takuma himself, his years in prison passed in complete isolation. According to the penitentiary authorities, he complied with the regime, avoided conflicts with staff, and caused no incidents. This once again creates a disturbing contrast between his behavior in a controlled environment and what occurred in 2001. Here, another question emerges, one that is rarely voiced aloud. If a person can remain under control for years without incident, does that mean the core problem was not only his illness, but also the absence of control at the crucial moment? This question does not remove responsibility, but it forces a broader view of the story. In 2004, the sentence became final. What followed were years of waiting. For society, silence. For the system, slow, almost invisible changes. For Takuma, confinement, and time that passed without outward incident. It was in this silence that the case began to acquire its true meaning. It ceased to be only a story about a crime, and became a story about the limits of responsibility, control, and decisions made too late. The end of this story came later, and it was as quiet as the years that preceded it. In the next final part, we will ask the last question of this case. Not about punishment, not about the criminal, but about whether this tragedy could have been stopped at any stage, and what this story ultimately says about all of us. When Mamoru Takuma was executed in 2008, the state formally closed the case. For the system, this meant one thing. The sentence had been carried out, the criminal punished, the process completed. But when you look at the full story, it becomes clear that this case did not truly end on the day of the attack, nor on the day of the trial, nor even on the day of the execution. It ended much earlier, at the moment when the system decided that nothing more needed to be done. If all the events are placed side by side, years of treatment, repeated hospitalizations, discharges, medical records, police incidents, forensic examinations, what emerges is not a story of sudden madness, but a story of constant postponement. Each decision seemed logical on its own. Together, they created a vacuum of responsibility. Doctors acted within the law. Police followed procedures. The court applied the criminal code. At every individual moment, everything was formally correct. The problem was that no one was responsible for the entire picture. This is one of the rare cases where no sensational revelations appeared after the tragedy. There was no hidden document. No single catastrophic decision that could be labeled the fatal mistake. Instead, there was a chain of small, routine decisions that gradually erased the very idea of prevention. And that is what makes this story dangerous, not only for Japan, but for any country. When a system reacts only once a threat becomes obvious, it will always react too late. And in such cases, delay is not measured in minutes, but in years. After the events in Ikeda, Japan did change many things. School security was strengthened. Information exchange between institutions improved. Long-term psychiatric supervision began to be discussed more seriously. But all of these changes became possible only after children had died. This leads to the most uncomfortable question of the entire case. Could the tragedy have been prevented if the system had changed before, not after? The facts suggest that it could have. There were moments when intervention could have been stricter, when discharge could have been paired with real monitoring, when medical warnings could have been connected to police data, when someone could have looked not at isolated episodes, but at the full history of one person. But that never happened. And one more thing must be said. This case is not about isolating people with mental illness. It is about the danger of assessing risk in fragments. People do not exist in fragments. They exist in processes. Mamoru Takuma did not appear out of nowhere on June 8, 2001. He was shaped over years within a system that saw him in parts, but never as a whole. In that sense, responsibility is far more widely distributed than a single sentence can reflect. This story is not frightening only because of the number of victims, although that alone is horrifying. It is frightening because it feels familiar. Almost every country operates with similar mechanisms, similar legal limits, similar institutional blind spots. And after every tragedy, the same phrase is repeated: no one could have predicted this. In the Ikeda case, that is not true. The warning signs were not invisible. They were simply filed away in different folders. Perhaps the most important conclusion of this case is not that the system failed, but that it worked exactly as it was designed to work. Which means the real question is not only about individual decisions, but about the rules that shape them. This was a story about a crime. But more than that, it was a story about the limits of responsibility. And as this case shows, those limits sometimes end precisely where real danger begins. That is why it is important to analyze such cases calmly and based on facts, and not only on emotions and headlines. Because behind every tragedy there are decisions that were made long before the finale. Thank you for watching this video to the end. If it is important for you not only to know what happened, but also to understand why it became possible, you can stay on the channel. Here we are talking about such stories.